Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrera here for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. This is a Source Saturday video series within a series. Today I am talking with people related to comic books. The idea of Source Saturday was to introduce teachers and other educators to primary and secondary sources that can challenge the ways we normally teach particular time periods. And what I'm doing with this series of videos is I am talking with people related to comic books about how we can bring things like imagination, magic realism, Afrofuturism to our study of history. I've talked to people that are in the process of creating graphic novels, people that have published things as independent artists and writers, people who are Eisner Award nominated graphic novelists. I've talked with professors. I've talked to people interested in digital humanities. I've talked to so many people, and this series is so wonderful. Watch them one by one, or listen to them one-on-one, or watch them independently. But together, they really demonstrate the richness of teaching and learning history when we bring in space for art and imagination and interpretation. So enjoy these conversations. In this video, I am talking with Dr. Walter Greason, which I am just so excited to. We connected on Twitter, and when I read the bio he sent me, I was like, why, thank you for making time for me. He is a Dean Emeritus at the Honor School, an Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Educational Counseling and Leadership at Monmouth University in New Jersey. He is the writer and lead editor on 6 books, and he's contributed substantially to at least 3 other books. He is part of heritage and history, like doing and mobilization through his work primarily in the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation, which led to the restoration of a National Historic Landmark, dedicated to, quote, the most militant journalist of the late 19th century, T. Thomas Fortune. And he has also been working with Megan Allas, she's a graphic artist, on a really cool video game project called Sojourners Trail that teaches about Afrofuturism as well as the Black Speculative Arts Movement. That is a huge mouthful. I'm so excited to meet him. And when we connected on Twitter and I was telling him about this series, I was like, well, what is a source you want to talk about? And he said, how about Afua Cooper's The Hanging of Angelique, which is a Canadian book on the history of the burning of Montreal by accused enslaved woman by the name of Angelique. Now, not a lot of Americans, not a lot of Canadians, but I don't think a lot of Americans also know that there was slavery in Canada. There were a lot of enslaved people. And so when he brought to me this source, this American scholar bringing to me this Canadian source, I was like, we definitely can talk about that. Are you doing anything related to graphic novels and this work? And he's like, I'm thinking about doing it, and I would love to talk about the process and also how I've intersected like illustrations and graphics with teaching and learning history. And I was like, yes, let's do this. So let's go over to Zoom, talk to Walter about his plans for the burning of Angelique, but also about how and why he connects graphics with teaching and learning history, because like the work that he's done has been so interesting and imaginative that I'm really excited to hear about his process and to be able to think about the future Hanging of Angelique graphic novel. So let's go over to Zoom. Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrera here for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. This is a Source Saturday video series within a series. Today I am talking with people related to comic books. The idea of Source Saturday was to introduce teachers and other educators to primary and secondary sources that can challenge the ways we normally teach particular time periods. And what I'm doing with this series of videos is I am talking with people related to comic books about how we can bring things like imagination, magic realism, Afrofuturism to our study of history. I've talked to people that are in the process of creating graphic novels, people that have published things as independent artists and writers, people who are Eisner Award nominated graphic novelists. I've talked with professors. I've talked to people interested in digital humanities. I've talked to so many people, and the series is so wonderful. Watch them one by one, or listen to them one-on-one, or watch them independently. But together, they really demonstrate the richness of teaching and learning history when we bring in space for art and imagination and interpretation. So enjoy these conversations. In this video, I am talking with Dr. Walter Greason, which I am just so excited to. We connected on Twitter, and when I read the bio he sent me, I was like, why, thank you for making time for me. He is a Dean Emeritus at the Honor School, an Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Educational Counseling and Leadership at Monmouth University in New Jersey. He is the writer and lead editor on 6 books, and he's contributed substantially to at least 3 other books. He is part of heritage and history, like doing and mobilization through his work primarily in the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation, which led to the restoration of a National Historic Landmark dedicated to, quote, the most militant journalist of the late 19th century, T. Thomas Fortune. And he has also been working with Megan Allas, she's a graphic artist, on a really cool video game project called Sojourners Trail that teaches about Afrofuturism as well as the Black Speculative Arts Movement. That is a huge mouthful. I'm so excited to meet him. And when we connected on Twitter and I was telling him about this series, I was like, well, what is a source you want to talk about? And he said, how about Afua Cooper's The Hanging of Angelique, which is a Canadian book on the history of the burning of Montreal by accused enslaved woman by the name of Angelique. Now, not a lot of Americans, not a lot of Canadians, but I don't think a lot of Americans also know that there was slavery in Canada. There were a lot of enslaved people. And so when he brought to me this source, this American scholar bringing to me this Canadian source, I was like, we definitely can talk about that. Are you doing anything related to graphic novels and this work? And he's like, I'm thinking about doing it, and I would love to talk about the process and also how I've intersected like illustrations and graphics with teaching and learning history. And I was like, yes, let's do this. So let's go over to Zoom, talk to Walter about his plans for the burning of Angelique, but also about how and why he connects graphics with teaching and learning history, because like the work that he's done has been so interesting and imaginative that I'm really excited to hear about his process and to be able to think about the future Hanging of Angelique graphic novel. So let's go over to Zoom. Walter, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. I know that you're busy just like everyone is, but like this year in particular is so extra busy that it's such a pleasure to find time to talk with you. So thank you so much.
It's a joy to be here with you. Thank you for opening the opportunity.
Do you want to introduce yourself before we get started?
So hi, I'm Walter Greason. I'm a professor of educational leadership here at Monmouth University in West Long Branch. Mostly people know me for working with the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation in Red Bank, New Jersey, and the work we did to save a National Historic Landmark. Hopefully, people will also come to learn a little bit about the video game design work we're doing to bring classroom teaching into the 21st century.
And you're interested in comic books. Like we can talk about all those things together, which is exciting.
Yeah, no, that I do say the last 2 years, most of my talks have been about my Wakanda syllabus and the ideas that went into making the Black Panther movie. And so, yeah, the stuff I did with Christopher Priest and Reginald Hudlin back in the early 2000s, it was just astonishing to see that film come together.
Yeah, it's amazing how a series of ideas can help spark so much community amongst people that wouldn't have necessarily been connecting over those types of ideas. Like, it gives them like a platform to talk through those ideas, which is why it's extra cool to be able to see that come together through the movie, but also like the community that came from the movie.
Absolutely. Great and well said.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, we're going to start. I mean, this is starting off really well. So in this like little series of me talking to people related to comic books and teaching and learning history, we connected on Twitter, and we're talking about something that's not actually a comic book yet, which is kind of cool. We're talking about this book, The Hanging of Angelique by Afua Cooper, which is a history, like a Canadian history, although you are based in the States. So it's extra cool, like, to make that connection. Do you want to tell people a little bit about this history, and then we can kind of move into why we're talking about this and thinking about this related to comic books?
So yes, absolutely. That is one of my favorite historical works. And unlike a lot of my colleagues, I do take the idea of being involved with North American history very seriously. I'd say about a decade ago, I started studying the economic history of North America. And you can't really start with Jamestown or Plymouth Rock. You have to really start with the Caribbean. You have to start with the French settlements along kind of Nova Scotia. And so those efforts to study Canada, to study Mexico before getting into the idea of British North America are tremendously important to me. And that work drew me to The Hanging of Angelique and Afua Cooper's a brilliant way of getting us into colonial Canada, this New France. And so Montreal in particular is a fascinating place for me historically, in that the work I was doing that won a major grant back in 2016 was transnational economic history that looked at British settlements at the core of it. I think the initial comparison was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Charleston, South Carolina. But very rapidly, I realized I had to study Veracruz, Mexico. I had to study Havana, Cuba. The work I did on Liverpool in the United Kingdom is just, I can't believe the nature of how that place changed over the 18th century. And then, of course, Montreal was something very surprising for me, was the role of the slave trade in the city of Montreal in the first half of the 18th century. And so in drilling in, Hanging of Angelique was the center of what I put together for that analysis. And what I do is economic history that's based in urban geography. How do we see that the way the infrastructure of a place changes as their commercial footprint expands? And so her story is, to me, a forerunner of what is happening in New York City and New Amsterdam around the same time, that fire is this enormous weapon for folks who are dispossessed to kind of fight back against military and religious authority. And as important as the burning of the city is, and as a historian of slavery, fire over and over again comes up as a way that those who are enslaved attempt to destroy the people who are holding them as property. The nuances of Angelique's story, as it comes into her receiving most of the blame she becomes a convenient scapegoat for authority to kind of impose a new social order coming out of the disaster. And so that process for me is very telling. It speaks to a lot of the things that play out over the remaining decades of the 18th century as the French are renegotiating kind of their global ambitions in relationship to the English. And so that whole process and the tragedy of what happens as she loses her life sets a table for what, as an Americanist, when I came up through studying surveys of U.S. history, people are romanticizing the story of Nat Turner in Virginia. And this is a man who in 1831 organizes a revolt and attempts to overthrow the slaveocracy, the government of plantation owners. And Angelique instead casts a very different light a century earlier about the nature of the early slave trade and how that sets the table for anything we consider as the Enlightenment or a Great Awakening. All of those kind of larger cultural forces take on a new tone. And in particular, to tell her story, I think one of the graphic novels that had the most impact on me in this kind of project was Abina and the Important Men. And I remember when that was sent out when it was initially published, and I was like, this is a really powerful way to do women's history in transnational context. It's not just about one place or one situation. There are so many voices of women of the past that we can recapture by turning them into art and begin to kind of explore the contradictory nature of historical narratives using sequential art. And so that's my hope that, you know, a couple years from now, we have a pretty good track record of taking ideas from concept to reality, that we'll have some kind of comic about Angelique that would be amazing.
Okay, so thank you so much for that, but also I have a problem with everything you just said because I want to say so many things because I was just like, this is amazing. so, so let me just take like a couple steps back. So Angelique was a woman who was enslaved in New France, just for people that don't know the story, and she was accused of setting her enslaver's house on fire, which then the fire caught across Montreal, and so it burned Montreal down, and she was accused and found guilty and then hung because of this fire. So for people that needed that context, and also for anyone Americans watching, because often, well, I mean, it's true for Canadians too, we don't often associate slavery with Canada. Canada is so often in this history of slavery as like the free North, but we had slavery here for hundreds of years. And so that is such, so this, when this book came out, it was such an important reminder of these histories. And one of the first and only, like Afua Cooper calls this a slave narrative, in that she's pulling from the court records to be able to bring Angelique's voice into the story as much as possible. And so first, I love how you place the story in a transnational economic and geographic context, but I especially loved how you brought it in at the end to talk about gender, because you know, one of the things that really bugs me as a history education person is that when we fetishize certain types of primary sources, we lose the voices of many people who those types of sources would not have been available to create or to preserve. And that's primarily women of color. And so how do we honor those voices? And I love how you ended that by saying you can bring women into the narrative by drawing them in. So you're interested in turning this into a comic book or a graphic novel. What are the kind of images that you're associating with this story that you want to bring to life?
So this is the thing that I've found most amazing in the kind of arc of my career, is that when I came to social media, probably in 2007, I opened up a Facebook page, and then published my first book in 2010 and put up a Facebook page for the book. And it was a photographic history. So you could tell I was already doing something that was leaning towards graphic media. And so I had done these 40 oral history interviews. The subjects had gifted me their photo albums about their lives. And so I wanted to, the first book I wanted to come out, I did not want it to be a traditional university press book that everybody's like, you got to do this thing to get tenure. I was like, no, I'm going to do something that is a popular press book. You don't have to give me any credit for it towards my tenure line. I need to make the statement that we're doing something that reaches a wider audience and uses a larger variety of sources. And so that book was The Path to Freedom, and it's still by far the best-selling book I've done. That basically tells the story of two families during the Great Migration moving to New Jersey and escaping lives of being sharecroppers or domestic servants, and their children succeeding through church and school to become these civil rights leaders a decade before Martin Luther King Jr. And so it's got this powerful story, but it's the images that stick with people. It's the images and the things that make it relatable. People buy into. They're like, this looks like parts of my family. Why has no one told a story of my community this way? And so digging into the photographs, I did the traditional University Press book based on some of the stuff that came out of Path to Freedom. And I've continued to kind of explore the ways that these images, and what it's when you say the images of Angelique, it's what comes out of a project like I did with T. Thomas Fortune is there are only a couple images. You know, you can't really find a lot of kind of contemporaneous portraiture of women like Angelique, but artists are really gifted if you give them that are the remnants of historical materials. And I think of some of the work that's come out of Black women historians on African women and African diaspora work. You can take those images and adapt them exactly in the way that this online comic does about T. Thomas Fortune. T. Thomas Fortune, there are only like 3 or 4 pictures of him that has survived over the last century. But the artist takes those and is then able to extrapolate other pieces of evidence, other stories, and create these graphic renditions that bring people into the story and give them an emotional and an intellectual touchstone to connect with the character created in the art. And I know with the work that Cooper has done with Angelique, and just the surviving remnants of Black history in Montreal, there are so many amazing images to be generated just out of the riverfront. I'm thinking around the site of the court where she was hung, the church, the cathedral down on the main street. Like, these are enormously gorgeous things to render that, in putting them in an artistic context, the audience will never forget it. They'll feel like they were right there through the process. And so, in all honesty, there's another guy that did an amazing book on New York I should give credit to, is Ira Berlin. Did this extraordinary public history book called Slavery in New York. And it's all like reproduced historical documents, portraiture, images, any fragment that he could put together about the enslaved Black community in New York prior to 1750. It's just a gorgeous text that was funded by the New York Public Library, and so, or the New York Historical Society. And so historians, those of us who work with the rare document, we have this sensitivity about, we've got to stitch the story together somehow. And that historical imagination, I think, is very appropriate for graphic arts.
I mean, when you started by talking about like your first book, you wanted it to be a popular press. You didn't want like traditional academic press. The first thing I thought of was storytelling. Like, what are the stories that we're telling, but also what are the ways that we frame the audience by the stories that we're telling, right? And one of the things I heard from your answer about not wanting to do a regular academic press is that you didn't want it to be for a particular type of audience that wouldn't enter in the story with the same, I don't know, history or spirit perhaps as people looking at a popular book that is a collage of photographs that people might be familiar with, but also might surprise them. And I think that rather than if we don't have the photographs, we can still infuse these stories with life. And in some ways, we give them greater life by bringing in imagination to them.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the heart of the profession. That's where I feel our kinship is really particularly deep. Mm-hmm. That the way we can communicate with large groups of people who will value the ways that we do the work, but in a wide variety of ways that we might not even be able to anticipate. Mm-hmm. That's the joy. Like, you bring someone that says, I saw something, and you're like, I never saw that. That's amazing. How'd you get there?
Yeah.
And those conversations are some of the most rewarding ones I have.
And so I developed the education and exhibition program at the Archives of Ontario. And one of the key elements I wanted in the workshops that we gave to students was to give them permission to look at archival material and tell stories about it. And I would often use a collection that didn't have a lot of information to just be like, what do you think could be happening here? Because young people are often, unless they like understand themselves as an artist, they're often like afraid to like do some drawing or do this and that. And so I love the notion of collaging with archival material, but that and like you said, like there's still places in Montreal that are going to be very similar, but it's really interesting to infuse it with art. What is your process? What has been your process with working with artists and in relation to bringing some of these ideas to fruition?
My goodness, that's a much longer discussion.
I mean, we don't need to stick on that, but I guess what I'm really interested in is like, how do you bring together the story in a medium that already is based on collaboration?
Yeah, so again, as a comic book fan, someone who love of reading came from a very early age in a dollar store, my mother picking up a handbook of the Marvel Universe and letting me have this 65-cent book and just reading and reading until it was worn out, like all the character descriptions and swept away by the art and the story blended together. Yeah, the graphic arts piece it's fundamental to how I think. And when I got the chance beyond tenure to think about, okay, now I have the chance to really think about my career and what kind of work do I want to produce over time. You know, I see my very successful colleagues, they'll produce the first book and the second book, they'll put 2 articles in 2 of the best top level journals, and then they kind of sit back and look around and just consider, what do I want to do next? And on the one hand, the fact of my activism and the fact that I do a lot of work to kind of feed the hungry, to kind of provide shelter to the homeless, that those things are much more important to me than kind of academic rank and which publisher I publish with, and you know, the kind of status that ties to professional academy. But for me, when I looked at my career opportunity, I was like, I've starved myself from the art that I love to produce the kind of more traditional, even though it wasn't traditional, even though it was just more traditional. I was like, I want to break the barrier of what we consider quality history. And so I remember reading a book, a series that started with The Approaching Fury by Stephen Oates. And he's essentially a historical novelist. And he takes primary source documents and then he writes in the voice of the characters, of the people who wrote the primary sources. And it's normally a dozen or so characters that he puts in interaction. In The Approaching Fury, it's the years leading up to the Civil War. And it's just astonishing to watch slave owners and abolitionists in dialogue in this fictional setting in his book. And he gets criticized roundly for not doing real history, but his books are wildly popular and millions of people read them. And so that's always the balance I'm struggling with. And for me, it's digital production, it's art that grounds history. And so I want to say back around 2011, 2012, I started working with this really talented artist, Rupa Dasgupta, and she would, on my social media, create posters and images that are just gorgeous works of art about conferences I was holding or presentations I was giving. With Julian Chambliss at Michigan State. At that time, he was in Florida at Rollins, and he runs a Zora Neale Hurston Festival. And I asked Rupa to put together something about a disappearing community that would kind of represent what my research was talking about, but also what was happening to Zora's hometown. And she did this just gorgeous, gorgeous rendering of a sunset that takes up the poster but then there's like an invisible castle fading into the background that's in superimposed over the sunset. And it's still one of the most beautiful pieces of work I've ever seen. And I can't believe I got to use it to kind of advertise an academic talk. But like, that experience convinced me. There's just wild engagement online with all of the work she produced. And so she got another job. She's still doing amazing art, but doing it for a firm that pays her ridiculous amounts of money. And
Good
so
for her.
I have a new graphic artist partner, Megan Allas, who is spectacular. But what I did with Megan, when I realized what we could do, I have this massive data set about the economic growth of the world economy that goes back like 5,000 years. And I was like, okay, how can we render this visually? And so I want to hold something up.
Please.
So I was running through a bookstore, and this is a book of graphic, like infographic visualizations about global economic change, but only in like the last 20 or 30 years. And it's just full of art. It's a picture book designed by social scientists to explain economic and social patterns. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to do that the rest of my life.
That thing.
Exactly. I'm going to create really easy ways for people to understand complex phenomena that's rendered visually. And so I have probably 50 infographics about different places at different times and how their economies changed as a result of different social forces. And I have the big ones, the ones that are about the world economy. I have those up and available online. But it's always about the power of art, and it's immediate when someone sees it. They look at it and they're just fascinated with kind of peeling back the layers of data that are represented in the image. And so the most advanced forms of it for me are interactive and 3D objects. And so I got my dean to build a technology lab here at my university. And so
That seemed like so easy. Just like, please build a lab.
he asked the provocative question of saying, if you needed something that would help you be more productive, what would it be? And I was like, oh, I need a digital art lab to kind of make sure I can do all this stuff. And so we got an IDM table and a big like 72-inch screen and multiple Macs. And I can take students in there and design all kinds of different art projects, interactive tools. Everything from like a video like this that we embed different graphics into, all the way through podcasts. We can do any number of digital media products and ground it in the data set that we've generated. And so that's, for me, the power of graphic design. It brings not just a wider audience, but even for colleagues of mine who are very serious kind of social scientists or even hard scientists, they can encounter and recognize knowledge that they have, but realize that the art helps communicate it in ways that they struggle to.
I don't know if you saw that when you said art grounds history, I was like that just blew my mind, because I love that so much. I have written about how a certain kind of, again, fetishization of certain types of archival sources and the discipline of history continues to colonialize and create androcentric and white supremacist boundaries around knowledge. And one of the things I hear from your answer is how you also see art as a way to allow a flourishing of different knowledges and people and ways at knowing and being known, which is just a really exciting way as the core of understanding. And that's just a really exciting way to think about the future of how we present information, how we teach and learn, and how we invite young people into coming to know and coming to make sense of the world around them.
As you were laying that out, I realized I left out something important.
All right.
um, I got tenure at a small school in Pennsylvania based on my first two books, and then family emergency. My mother and my sister became quite ill, and I had to move back to Jersey, and I came to Monmouth because it was the closest institution I could work at while helping care for them. The first project I did coming back to New Jersey was a project called the Holy Bible, Dignity and Divinity. And it started with a really basic question. It said, what if Mary had a daughter? And instead of making it a kind of academic argument, I worked with a graphic artist out of Detroit who made it a comic book. And I will send you a copy of the comic. So it's basically 8 one-page stories about, like, instead of Eve giving Adam the apple, what if Adam gave Eve the apple? There's a story of David and Bathsheba, that instead of David being the king who is seduced or seduces this woman, Bathsheba's the queen who seduces this other woman's husband. We take all the gender dynamics of the Bible and we flip them on the head using art. And so I thought you might like that.
Yeah, I'm definitely into that. And just seeing how it would be interpreted. Yes, please send me a copy or give me a link, because it would be really cool. And what's cool too, especially in doing this little series, is that I've talked to people who've worked with different artists or script writers in their career, and then like to see like their work but look different in all these different ways. Like, it's just really cool to see all these different interpretations and ways you don't see that if you're just text-based. And the thing about Afua is that she's a trained historian, but she's also a poet. Like, I think of her as a poet first. And it's interesting because this reads very traditional, but then there's like these elements that are very, very poetic. And it's this, and so I can totally see it as a graphic novel and bringing in all these ideas that you have talked about. I mean, you should just get on that right now. like just, if you could get that ready for the next couple of weeks, we can just put the link up.
I'm thinking I'm doing my media course right now. So if one of the students decides that they're looking for something, that could definitely happen by December.
All right. You just get on that. As a way to just kind of wrap up our conversation, why do you think that this history in particular, but maybe just more like graphic art and art more generally, how can that challenge the ways we normally teach history in like a high school or elementary school class, for example?
Yeah, I promise you show an elementary school classroom, Jesus as a woman, you're gonna get some. What? Hold on. What? How?
What? No.
So no, I am very much about the project of having students raise questions and think critically and creatively is the way I talk about it. Is that it's one thing to kind of interrogate and question the boundaries and the depths of the work that we encounter. But then when they begin to create their own work and their own approaches to the knowledge that they've gained, it sticks. It becomes this transformative experience for them. And so at any level, you don't have to say this is just for high schoolers or this is just for elementary schoolers. There's any number of ways you can adapt this to work at every grade level and really throughout adult education.
For sure.
One of my favorite doctoral classes are educators, folks who are principals and superintendents. And I was trying to get them into the analysis of iconography. How do we celebrate the idea of excellence in educational settings? And so we analyzed our School of Education. What posters did we put up? What images did we use to kind of create the expectation of being excellent? But then we walked to the athletic facility and looked at how they constructed excellence differently. What did they do with their imagery and with their material culture that communicated their sense of aspiration? Then we went to our business school and watched how they construct theirs. And then ultimately we went to our main administrative building and looked at all the portraits of the board of directors and all the portraits of the university presidents and talked about what goes into all of that imagery. And all of a sudden, they just had an entirely different view of how to use the kind of symbols within their educational spaces about what they're celebrating and how they communicate it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is, it's a really powerful example to end with, because now, of course, I have to say something, because like that is so, it's such an important way to understand the symbolism of the world around us, because so often people will say, oh, young people don't know Canadian history or American history. And I'm like, well, they know who is included and who is excluded, because they're surrounded by that all the time, on the money, on portraits, on the names of streets. And that, yes, we can use images and graphics to imagine a more creative and critical future, but we also have to realize how our graphics and our images are binding us to a specific future and how we use them. Like an example I use in my book, Transforming the Canadian History Classroom, is that teachers would highlight to Black students how there weren't any Black people a part of like pictures of World War II soldiers, for example. So then the students they only understood themselves to be absent from the spaces. And that was the ways that the teacher was trying to include them, by saying how absent they were. And it was like this back and forth that they weren't realizing how they would systematically exclude students over and over and over again. And that's just a really powerful way to end, and a really interesting way to go from like a comic book, a 65-cent comic book, to principals walking around a business school and a gymnasium to see what is success and excellence.
I am so thankful for the chance to talk, and I hope we talk much more. This was just one of the best conversations I've ever had.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad it could happen. Thank you so much. And yes, let's stay in touch. Okay, bye.
Bye.